I put my trust in your mercy. My heart is joyful because of your saving help. Amen. Abraham, what God is this that requires your only son? That question has haunted me ever since I was a kid. Reading a children's book of Bible stories. You know the kind of book I mean. A big, colorful, illustrated book with Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the Tower of Babel, Noah's Ark, and, of course, Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac. Because I can't completely trust my memory on these sorts of things, I found one of those illustrated Bible stories and looked up the chapter called Abraham is Tested. It tells how Isaac was growing up to be a fine boy and that his father and mother were very thankful to God for him. But one day, it says, God decided to test Abraham. God told Abraham that he must offer Isaac as a sacrifice. Abraham was heartbroken, but he had absolute faith in God. So he prepared everything and took Isaac up to the mountain alone. Under these words in the book is a full-page picture of Abraham, a knife in one hand, his other hand holding down Isaac, who is bound by ropes and lying on a bed of branches on a large stone altar. Isaac is looking away from his father. What child does not look at that picture and immediately identify with Isaac? What must he have been feeling? Was he scared? Confused? Did he cry? The words in the book gently continue to tell us that because Abraham's faith was strong, an angel stepped in and held Abraham's hand back. It concludes, and the angel told Abraham that God would truly bless him and his descendants because of his faith. Isaac is saved, replaced by a nearby ram. Now that I have a family, I've come to identify more with Abraham, a father asked to show calm on the outside while I'm sure he was devastated for what he was commanded to do. What must he have been thinking? Was he scared? Confused? Did he cry? I'm very thankful that this reading was assigned to this week and not last week, because last week was Father's Day, and that would have just been too much. Many of the stories of the Old Testament are practically tailor-made for telling to children. They're mostly stories with a clear moral, and the consequences make sense. God expelled Adam and Eve because they wanted more than they were given. God collapsed the Tower of Babel because of human hubris. God flooded the world but saved a good family and many animals. We behaved badly. God got angry. But in the end, God's actions made sense. And there was a clear lesson, a lesson even a child reading stories in an illustrated book could grasp. Finding a moral in this story about Abraham and Isaac is a bit trickier. On the surface, it seems pretty easy. Have faith in God. But it's the details that have always tripped me up. Seemingly out of nowhere, Genesis chapter 22 gets right to the crux. God tested Abraham. Before this, there was no ambivalence in the way Abraham had been acting toward God, and no act that we can point to that provoked God. Just an abrupt, cold open. God tested Abraham. I'll concede that God doesn't need a precipitating act for anything. God does as God does. But it's the magnitude of the test that's really disturbing. God says, take your son and offer him as a burnt offering on one of these mountains that I shall show you. Kill your son, Abraham, the one you love, the one you waited so long for. Your only path to the promise God had made just a few chapters before, a promise to make of you a great nation with descendants more than the stars. I've read a fair number of commentaries on the meaning of the sacrifice of Isaac. The most common focus, of course, is on Abraham's faith and the blessing that comes from that faith. That's how the children's books cast it, and there's merit in viewing it that way. Focusing only on Abraham's faith, however, seems to me to sidestep the most troubling and problematic part of the story, God's demand of Abraham. How does a God capable of making this demand speak to us today? How can we approach a God who plays brinkmanship with the life of a faithful man's son, a life to be taken by that faithful man's own hands? The Bible is full of things that don't make sense to us today. Whenever we encounter Bible stories that normalize slavery, misogyny, polygamy, burnt offerings, child sacrifice, and many other practices that are offensive to us, we often say that you have to view these practices in the context of the times. Things were different back then. That same argument is coming up a lot today because of statues, or works of art, or books, or movies, or other artifacts where the subject or theme reflected the norms of a different time. Viewing any of these in context does not mitigate the fact that they are offensive and wrong. We as a society have grown and hopefully will continue to grow, even if too slowly, to understand that there is a universal right and context is not an excuse. Through the teachings of Jesus and Paul and the apostles and great thinkers like Francis, Augustine, Luther, and countless theologians, even down to bishops and priests and preachers who fill pulpits today, we have come to know and grow close to a God who is love and compassion and redemption and comfort and reason. How can the God we know today square with the God who tested Abraham? Is that explained by context as well? That's a tough theological question that I'm not sure I'm equipped to address. However, what we can do is draw out the major themes in the story and examine them, bring them forward, and ask how we today can find God's grace in them. One of these themes is obedience. The evidence of Abraham's obedience is fairly clear. God spoke, Abraham obeyed immediately and without question. Our relationship with obedience today is somewhat more complex. We've largely stricken the word obey from our marriage vows. Its connotations are too antiquated, hierarchical, and submissive. But Paul, in today's reading from Romans, offers us a way to think about a discipline of obedience that transcends antiquation. Paul writes, "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of that one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness?" The slave reference notwithstanding, his point is that everyone obeys something. You can obey your base instincts and be forever entrapped by sin, or you can give your obedience to God, which leads to righteousness. Our world is complex and messy, and we're often tempted by expediency, faster ways to money, faster ways to pleasure, quick and easy slogans that blame others for all of our troubles. Yet Paul's take on obedience speaks directly to us. God's righteousness demands that we put in the work to be obedient to what is universally right, and that is rarely quick or easy. Another important theme from the Abraham story is trust. When Isaac recognizes that they had the fire and the wood for the sacrifice, but no lamb, he trusted his father when he said that God would provide. Isaac trusted Abraham even though he didn't understand. And of course, Abraham trusted God even though he didn't understand. Today we may not experience God's booming voice as Abraham did, but we have to trust that God is constantly speaking to us in whispers as we navigate the complexities of our lives in this world. And finally, there's the theme of faith. Abraham's faith was tested, and Abraham proved worthy of that faith. If we focus on the test, then it's nearly impossible to transport the meaning of that faith into today's world. Child sacrifice is an aberration, and anyone hearing the voice of God driving them to such acts is in need of serious mental health care. But our faith is tested every day in ways large and small. Where do we find love in a world full of hate? Where do we see the promise of God's kingdom in a world of turmoil? In today's gospel, Jesus says, "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me." There is where we find faith. As we open our metaphorical doors to welcome everyone as a child of God, we are welcoming God. This is easy when we welcome those who look like us, act like us, share our social and economic status. Where this takes faith is in finding the resolve to open our doors to those who challenge us, who may not believe as we do, who frighten us. It's in these hard encounters, if we are guided by the courage of faith, that our own faith expands. Abraham, what God is this who requires your only son? It is our God, Abraham, who speaks to us today through your obedience, through your trust, and through your faith. Amen.